Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is John Bilotta, and it's my distinct privilege to welcome you all to the Minnesota Stormwater Research Spotlight Seminar, part of the Minnesota Stormwater Series. We are starting another 18 months of series with a new twist this morning. Beginning today, we will be alternating every other month with spotlights on stormwater research projects in Minnesota. Opposite of those months, the Minnesota Stormwater Seminar Series will continue to feature nationally recognized experts on stormwater runoff and green infrastructure topics to share their wisdom and insights and help us continue to push the boundary of clean water management here in Minnesota. This effort is funded through the University of Minnesota Water Resources Center, the Clean Water Legacy Amendment, and the Minnesota Stormwater Research Council. We are hosted this morning by St. Anthony Falls Laboratory. I would like to thank Dr. John Gulliver and Dr. Andy Erickson and the entire team at SAFL for leading our efforts and making the entire series a huge success. I'd like to introduce everyone first to Dr. Mae Davenport, a colleague here at the University of Minnesota. She's a professor in the Department of Forest Resources and the director for the Center for Changing Landscapes here in the Twin Cities University of Minnesota campus. Her teaching and research focuses on human environmental values, beliefs, and behaviors, and community engagement in the environmental decision-making process. Her research program is particularly centered on community-based planning and policy for water protection, climate resilience, and environmental justice. She teaches courses on sustainable land use planning and policy and social science research methods. Today, she will be presenting her work titled From Policy to Action, Community-Driven Stormwater Management, one of our stormwater research program funded projects. Please join me in a virtual welcome to Mae.
All right, thanks, John. And thank you all for the invitation to speak. I'm gonna start my video here. Okay, there. Now I think you can see me and my monitor. Is that working all right for folks?
Yes, it looks great, Mae.
Okay, awesome. All right, so I'm very glad to be here to chat with you all, to share some of my research about community-driven stormwater management. And I'm just gonna kick it off with some thoughts. So from my perspective, water resources are community resources. Water resources are cultural resources. For me, the critical question in urban stormwater management is not what to do, but it's how to do it. How do we minimize stormwater runoff? How do we reduce pollutants that can contaminate stormwater? How do we optimize road de-icing practices? And no offense to anyone here, but to me, scientists like me and like other scientists, biophysical scientists, hydrologists, and engineers, they're involved in stormwater management solutions. But the community of residents and landowners and water users, the community has to be committed. Okay, so a little background on my research around inspiring community action for stormwater management. So I work with the Center for Changing Landscapes, and we kind of pride ourselves on doing community-driven research. And what does that mean? Well, it means that we are committed to developing partnerships and to engaging community members from the beginning of our projects. We also are committed to gathering social data, social science data, to bring narratives and different perspectives into policy decisions, into management strategies. And then ultimately, we develop tools or guidelines or recommendations around planning, policy, and practices that we hope that water resource managers, stormwater managers will apply in their work. So a big topic for us and a big concern for us is water justice. And so in my lab and in my center, we've been asking questions around, oh, that just went ahead. Let me go back. How would water planning and policy be different if Black, Indigenous, and people of color were fairly represented in decision-making processes? Water is a human right. Access to clean and abundant water and the many benefits of water is not a luxury or privilege for those who can afford it, or those who are able to live in neighborhoods with high capacity to manage or protect water. Water should not be an asset to white affluent communities and a liability to people of color or poor communities. As with many other things, the benefits and burdens of water are not distributed equally across landscapes and human communities. And similarly, as water is a human right, it is also a human or social responsibility. So, water problems are social problems. And that perspective, those philosophies and principles of thinking about water really inform our research and guide the research questions we ask, as well as our research methodologies. So in this particular project, funded by the Stormwater Research Council, we had 3 primary questions. First was, what are capacities of local water governments across Minnesota to engage their communities, diversely defined, in stormwater management? Second, what motivates residents, including BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities in Minnesota metropolitan areas like the Twin Cities, like Duluth, like St. Cloud, to engage in community issues such as stormwater management? And then third, what roles can community-based organizations, cultural organizations, local groups, local networks, and local governments play? What role can they play in inspiring community action for stormwater management among residents, among landowners, and water users? We use 4 methods to answer these questions, and 2 of them we've completed, and I'm going to be presenting some results from these, which is an online survey of local government staff and an on-site survey with racially and ethnically diverse community members. To come, we have a mail survey out in the mail. We hope it gets to where we expect it to go and that it's returned to us through USPS, but it's a survey of residents in the Duluth region and in the St. Cloud region. And then to come also, and we'll have to adapt and adjust based on this COVID pandemic environment that we're living in, but we want to conduct focus groups with community-based organizations as well as local government staff, really to collect not only statistics around how people's beliefs and feelings and attitudes towards water, but also stories of connections to water and concerns about water through those focus groups. Okay, so we started our conversations for this project, that partnership building, and talked to many folks across the Twin Cities region about water, about community engagement. And I think Sarah Roth is with us on this seminar, and she conducted a lot of that outreach and engagement to find out what people who had engaged communities and communities of color, what are some lessons learned? And we learned that we need to tap into and engage local communities, communication forums. How do communities get the word out on events or opportunities? We wanted to attend popular cultural events. We knew we needed to translate our water science jargon. We attempted and were successful in many ways at connecting with active community organizations. We informally interviewed some trusted cultural leaders. And then we learned as well that we needed the appropriate incentives to incentivize participation. So here's a picture of our exhibit, our survey station. And we engaged in 13 different cultural events from July through November of 2019. And we followed the recommendations from many of our partners, in that we had multilingual staff and signage. We used a very visually engaging exhibit for all ages. You can see here there are 5 cylinders where folks could drop a little pebble into the cylinder to sort of communicate their support for different water values, and all ages were invited to participate in that. And then we conducted the more formal tablet survey instrument. And we provided a $2 incentive for anyone who was willing to participate. So what did we learn from the on-site survey? First, I'm going to start with kind of a socio-demographic profile of our respondents. So this is the primary place of residence of our respondents. As I said earlier, we conducted these surveys in the Twin Cities metropolitan area, but not everyone that we engaged actually lives in the Twin Cities. Some were coming to these events from other places. So you can see here, primarily our folks in the darker shades were lived in Ramsey and Hennepin County, but we did have some other counties, other regions represented. Now here's a pie chart, a breakdown of the race and ethnicity that folks identified with on the survey. You can see here that we had 492 responses, and about 70% of those respondents identified as Black, Indigenous, or a person of color. We wanted to be very inclusive when we asked folks to identify their ethnicity. And so we included these categories here, which are slightly different than the US Census categories, but more inclusive and more locally based. You can see we have categories including Minnesota Chippewa tribe and Hmong, so that folks could better identify with the survey and see themselves represented in it. 25% of our respondents were white, and then you can see the breakdown. We had about 30% who identified as Asian, 18% identified as Black or African American, and then 10% identified as American Indian or Alaska Native. Okay, so we also asked about gender identity. Predominantly, our survey sample was identified as female, 55%. We also did have a percent of 4 to 5% of folks who identified as transgender, non-binary, or gender non-conforming, or preferred not to respond. And again, we wanted to be inclusive so people could see themselves represented in our survey. So here are some survey results around the perspectives on water. We had 4 big categories of questions that we asked in this on-site survey that took people about 7 to 10 minutes to complete on-site. We asked about views on water and water issues, people's water values, support for water protection, and then some broader questions about their own communities. Okay, so here's a question for you all. When you think of water, what first comes to mind? And I want you to look at these pictures, these 8 pictures here, and identify the picture that most accurately represents what comes to mind when you think of water. I'll give you a second. Okay, well, here are the results. These aren't your results. I wish we could do that. I wish we had the technology to do that. But here are the results from our survey. 50% of respondents identified with this picture in the bottom right, which is a young person drinking a glass of water. Let's see, 23% identified with this landscape picture of a lake and a forest, and 13% identified with water that they use for bathing or cleaning. And so this question was, intended to minimize some of the language barriers perhaps around water and to connect people visually with water values. So what were the core water values that our respondents expressed in this survey? Fundamentally, the most important water value to our respondents is water for drinking, clean drinking water. The survey asked to what extent are protecting Minnesota's water, to what extent is that important for these different values? And drinking water by far, for all of our subsets of populations, was the highest rated value. Other highly rated values on this 10-item scale were protecting water so as not to pollute our neighbors. And this is really referring to neighbors of other nations and other states as neighbors, protecting water for natural systems and processes, and then protecting water for equitable access for all Minnesotans. So as you can see here, a Minnesota water ethic is really kind of core to water values among our respondents, but safe drinking water is essential. Now, we're getting a little more complicated with these charts, but I'll walk you through it. So this is a chart that shows us those water values again. Again, it's a 10-item scale. And we subdivided our respondents in terms of their racial and ethnic identity. So we're comparing white respondents with people who identified as Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And the grayed out bars, like Minnesota does not pollute neighbors or that Minnesotans have equitable access, there are no statistical differences. Even though you might see slight differences in these percentages, statistically they're not different. So we can see there are shared water values around those items. But there were some statistical differences. Actually, 8 of the 10 items had differences. You can see drinking water for both whites and BIPOC respondents is the top value. But there is a slight difference in that white respondents valued, 92% of white respondents valued this item, drinking water, as extremely important, whereas 78% of our BIPOC respondents valued it as extremely important. So you can see some variation here. In some cases, our BIPOC respondents placed higher value on items such as quality recreation, reducing water treatment costs, opportunities for anglers to fish, water supply for lawns, watering vegetable gardens, and religious and cultural practices. So some interesting differences. We also asked questions about concerns and climate change. And from our BIPOC respondents, we learned, so this is that subgroup, we learned that 73% said they are very or extremely concerned about climate change, and 87% believe that climate change impacts to water is a moderate to severe problem. When we ask more specifically about what concerns our BIPOC respondents and then compare that to white respondents, there were a lot of similarities, but here are ones that stuck out as being differences, that BIPOC respondents were more concerned than white respondents about water damage to homes, about water supply, and also about drinking water contamination. Okay, so again, comparing white and BIPOC respondents, we can look at responses to civic engagement questions And this question was posed in the past 12 months, how often have you engaged in these actions? We have volunteered for a community event or organization, talked to others about water protection, attended a meeting, and then worked with other community members to protect water. And we see these percentages range from 78 or 86% down to 40 and 35%. Again, the grayed out ones mean there are no statistical differences between BIPOC and white respondents, but there was one item that was statistically different, and that was that BIPOC respondents were proportionately more likely to have worked with others in the community to protect water than white respondents. All right, so now this was a focused study on a small sample of folks in the Twin Cities who attended these cultural events. The year prior, in 2018, we conducted a more comprehensive survey that included a Minnesota water value scale, but it was statewide. And this project was funded by the Clean Water Legacy Funds, as well as the Environmental Trust Fund through a LCCMR grant. And so this is the primary residence of our respondents to this survey. We had almost 1,500 responses. And this is really the first statewide survey on water values. And we reached out to more than 4,000 Minnesotans. And so it gives us a different narrative, right, around water, because this includes urban and rural community members. It includes predominantly white, because we aren't able to represent BIPOC community members as well in this broader survey. But it's interesting to look at and to maybe make some comparisons of subgroups and think about how these values might inform stormwater management. So this scale, because it was a male survey, we were able to include 17 items in this Minnesota water value scale. So that was compared to only 10 items in the Twin Cities survey. But here, once again, drinking water was by far the highest rated value as being extremely important to protect. We see future generations at 80%, fish and wildlife habitat, safe beaches and lakes, and that Minnesota does not pollute neighbors. So to me, this tells me a little bit about not only Minnesota water values, but a water ethic. And that water ethic really includes sort of a social justice, environmental justice perspective, that we're not polluting others, that we're thinking about future generations, and that we're thinking about accessibility. More than 50% said that equitable access to water is extremely important to protect in Minnesota. Now, as I promised, we're going to look at some subgroups of this statewide survey. So we did some comparisons based on gender identity, and we found significant differences in 14 of 17 items. Overall, women place higher importance on protecting these values, including future generations, fish and wildlife habitat, safe beaches and lakes, all the way down to the opportunity for wild ricers to harvest wild rice, and lakeshore property values. So I've asked different groups that I presented to what this means. How do you interpret the fact that people who identify as women consistently rate these higher? And what I've heard from, in particular from women that I've presented to, is that women care more about water. And it wasn't a surprising result for them. But again, regardless of gender, we have these top water values: drinking water, future generations, fish and wildlife habitat, and safe beaches and lakes. We also are able to look at some differences between this Minnesota resident population overall and folks who either serve on the Clean Water Council or are a close partner or affiliate group representative of the Clean Water Council. What we did is we administered the online survey, the big survey, to both Minnesota residents overall, and then we asked the Clean Water Council folks to distribute the survey within their network. So we had 60 respondents to that. So this question, you might say, gets at like, who's making decisions and how much are decisions that the Clean Water Council makes and other sort of prominent water decision makers or influencers, how much do they align? We see a lot of alignment in those top valued items, including drinking water, future generations, fish and wildlife habitat. But I think there are also some really interesting differences or disconnects. We see 77% of Clean Water Council folks identified natural systems and processes as extremely important to protect, while about 55% of our general Minnesota resident survey identified that as important. The fact that Minnesota does not pollute neighbors was extremely important to 67% of our general survey, but only 45% of our Clean Water Council affiliates. So again, another opportunity to think about sort of what is the value of water, and to what extent do those values influence decision-making, influence funding allocation, and how water is protected in our state. And this is just a zoomed in so you can see those differences. 0% of Clean Water Council affiliates said that lakeshore property values was extremely important, but 34% of our general Minnesota respondents said it was important. And you see another big disparity here in the opportunity for anglers to fish. Okay, so that was the on-site survey conducted in the Twin Cities. And then we also looked at our bigger, broader statewide survey of Minnesota water values. Now we're gonna pivot a little bit and talk about the local government unit online survey that we conducted. And Sarah Roth really led this and had almost 200 responses. 65% of responses came from men, 95% were white, median age was 44, and then the government entities that they worked with are municipalities primarily, but also include some watersheds, sub-tribal tribal agencies, and then others. So we asked these respondents, what role do you play in stormwater management? 60% said planning, and they could select multiple roles. 60% said planning, 56% had some administration or grant management, 55% were engaged in stormwater monitoring, and then you see here 48% did some sort of education or outreach. And then only 2% of our respondents had no role in stormwater management. So we feel pretty good about at least that we were targeting the right folks, and we connected with people who really do have an influence on stormwater management. One of the questions we asked, and again, these are preliminary data, we just started analyzing them, are how important is it to manage stormwater in your LGU? 91% said it is extremely important that we are able to manage stormwater in my government unit. However, only 60% rate that their unit's effectiveness in stormwater management is very or extremely effective. So there is some disparity here, in fact, that it's so important, but they're not as effective maybe as they need to be. Some of the concerns that respondents voiced in our survey, the top concern was an increased frequency and intensity of storm events. So we can think about climate change impacts and how this is a big concern. Also, aging and insufficient stormwater infrastructure. 67% were concerned about road salting practices. About the same were concerned about flooding, and 56, more than half, were concerned about erosion and sedimentation. So what actions did respondents prioritize? What are the top actions that are needed to address stormwater management? Well, number one, they said we need to adapt to changing environments. We need to be flexible. We need to be able to adapt. We also need to develop strategic long-term plans that take into account and anticipate a changing environment. They talked about implementing capital improvement projects as being important, a top action, and then promoting stormwater management as a cultural norm, which got me excited because that's a lot of the work that we do, is trying to understand what are the cultural norms around water and around stormwater practices. What were some of the constraints? We know that these local government unit representatives feel constrained in terms of their effectiveness. And why is that? The top constraint identified was that other local issues are taking priority, that there's a lack of staff with those technical expertise and knowledge that are devoted to stormwater management, and that there's limited local buy-in or community engagement. And then finally, they talked about or responded that a lack of technical capacity is a constraint. Okay, so what have we learned so far? We know that there are a lot of commonalities in how people view water or think about stormwater management. Drinking water is important. Protecting drinking water is just fundamental to the Minnesota water ethic. We also know that there are some differences, right, between subgroups, different ethnic and racial identities, between men and women, between people with power and other, the public in Minnesota. And I think these differences and commonalities, should be taken into consideration. And we need to think about, whose voice or whose values is dominating the conversation. So 2 other studies and papers that we've published kind of examine this in more detail. First of all, we know from research, survey now, and qualitative research through interviews, cultural narratives of water matter. It matters in how people engage with water, how people engage with water planning. We also know from another study that was done in the Twin Cities is that community-based organizations and cultural organizations may be an untapped resource. We don't tend to reach out to folks who are organizing around housing or folks who are organizing around employment or health. And those people are, they're attached socially and they care about issues that affect their communities. And so they might be great champions and connectors for us in water management and stormwater management. Just a few more thoughts here. If we think about this as a Venn diagram where we have water decision makers and influencers like those Clean Water Council folks, predominantly white group, who are making the decisions and having a big influence. Then we have Minnesotans who have some agency and voice, or for whom their voices have been amplified. And we might describe them as white, predominantly white, and maybe affluent, maybe older Minnesotans who are able to engage in planning and decision-making processes. And then we have this important subgroup of Minnesotans whose agency and voice have been ignored or suppressed. And how can we think about changing? How can we think about and water justice in our programming? Well, first of all, I think it's clear we need more BIPOC decision makers and influencers. We need to find a way to support those communities to be engaged. Open up those barriers. We also need better processes for inclusive engagement so that we're not just engaging the folks who are all and efforts that are doing that. The socially attached community leaders and other organizers they are the ones who are most likely to civically engage and be engaged in water. So just a few acknowledgements. Sarah Roth was my co-author on this presentation, but I also want to acknowledge researchers including Amit Pradhanang, Emily Green, and Bree Duver. Had lots of students who worked on analyzing these data. And then we partnered with the Humphrey and Institute on the Environment for some of these efforts as well.
Thank you, Mae. And I'm sure we have a virtual round of applause, and apologies. We had a couple audio mishaps here. I'm going to begin with this question, Mae. I know we recorded this and people can go back and view it, but would you be willing to share your slides since we lost some of the audio during the recording?
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. Well, we just have a couple minutes for some questions, and we did get quite a few questions in here, so I'm just going to jump right in here, and we'll start with one that seems like has a lot of interest from folks. What are your strategies for building and maintaining long-term partnerships with communities that feel overstudied or underserved with respect to the U and regulatory?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a challenge, and it's a challenge for a scientist who's on a budget cycle, right? Of oftentimes our grants are 1-year grants or 2-year grants, but what it really takes is it takes relationship building. We have to step outside our own institutions and go to communities, whether it's tribal communities or Black communities in Minneapolis, and listen to their needs and listen to and address needs that these communities have that may initially seem outside of the water scope, because really they are not. Because we shouldn't put the burden on communities of color and indigenous communities to engage in predominantly white institutional processes. We need to develop and adapt and adjust so that we can insert these questions about water into the dialogues and the engagement that's already happening in communities, whether it's about public health, whether it's about crime, whether it's about housing. Those are water issues. And so connecting with communities and listening to communities and not coming in with an agenda has been critical to my research, and I think it's critical to any program that intends to meaningfully engage communities in this work.
Great, thank you. I know we are scheduled for about a 5-minute break now, but I know our next presentation is queued up to start in 5 minutes. So I'm going to continue on with some questions for Mae, because we have some great questions here, but we will begin the next presentation in about 5 minutes. So the next question, Mae, here is, one of the most important concerns in local stormwater management is the support for it among city leaders. Have you considered surveying local decision makers, city council members, directors of public works, and do you think that's worth pursuing?
Yeah, well, we did tap into some of those officials, some of those staff in our local government unit survey. And we did identify some of the constraints and some capacity concerns. But in terms of more broadly, like council members, board members, I think that's an excellent point, and certainly should be, you know, the next step, right? We've worked around a little bit more with groundwater issues, and we've got several publications around capacity to protect groundwater. And that was conducted with a broader range of folks at the local level. And so I think, you know, using that as a model and engaging and with those representatives that have decision-making power, but maybe not the expertise or the knowledge of water, that would be critical.
Great. Another question we have here is, how do you envision that these results can be incorporated into future policy and planning decisions?
Well, I think that this kind of social science is a form of community engagement, of public participation. It brings to light these hidden narratives around water. And so I think that it's a great opportunity for decision makers to think about these narratives when they're making decisions, help them understand how some policies or funding programs might align with these broader values, or maybe don't align, and why is that? So I think when we think about environmental justice, a survey like this can really bring to light some of those differences in how people connect with water and think about water. So I see it as a policy development tool. I see it as a strategy for thinking about community impacts of programs, and also for reflecting back to communities. Here's what we've heard from the BIPOC community, which of course is very diverse. There is no one BIPOC community, but here's what we're hearing from people of color. And we want to hear more. We want to learn more about perspectives. So it's a great way to reflect back to communities kind of what you're doing, how it aligns or how it's different from values in policy work.
I am pleased to welcome Geoff Maas as our second presenter this morning, featuring another one of our research projects funded by the Minnesota Stormwater Research Council. Geoff Maas is the Senior Geospatial Business Analyst for Ramsey County. He has 25 years of professional experience in the fields of urban planning, GIS, cartography, information design, and project management. In addition to his work with Ramsey County, he teaches courses in GIS and data visualization at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. He has served as co-coordinator of Metro Geodata Project since its inception in April of 2018. And this morning, Geoff will discuss his recently completed research project funded by the council, establishing a geodata standard for stormwater infrastructure. Please join me in a virtual welcome of Geoff as we begin to share his screen.
Thank you all, fantastic. So as John mentioned, I've been co-coordinating the Metro Stormwater Geodata Project since its inception in April of 2018. I'm happy to share with you our progress today on where we're at with it. So in the time I have with you, we'll cover the purpose of the project, short overview of the data schema that we're developing. We'll wrap up with our current status and then the upcoming work for the project. So in brief, just to cover what we're doing and why we're doing it, essentially we are defining the business needs for a stormwater geodata transfer standard. We're then developing a prototype standard, and then we will then publish that prototype standard and a sample data set in that standard for the testing and review of the entire stakeholder community. The long-term goal of this project is the wide availability of a stormwater geodata transfer standard that supports and facilitates creation of stormwater data in GIS, the maintenance of that data, the sharing of that data, and ideally the federating of that data across jurisdictions, with the sort of ultimate goal of greater availability of high quality stormwater GIS data for many different uses. So why do this? We have sort of functional needs and philosophical needs, and really the functional needs are, as I mentioned, to serve the creation, usage, maintenance, and sharing of that data, but also the fact that this resource really does not exist in a format that is desired by most people. We don't have an approved data standard that meets all of the needs. There are some local standards. There's some also very sort of use and context specific data standards. Esri, which is a GIS vendor, creates our GIS software. They have a data model, and we've borrowed heavily from that, but there isn't one that sort of meets all the needs. And then obviously the philosophical needs. I think, Mae hinted at this in her presentation. Water is a shared resource. It's something that doesn't, stop at the city boundary or the county boundary. And managing water is a complex topic with lots of interdisciplinary overlap, which I'll talk about some of the interests we've had there with that. So I don't need to spend much time on this with this audience, but as we all know, the landscape contains a wide variety of stormwater infrastructure. There are structures that convey stormwater, impound it, filter it, store it, you name it. It's all out there. And our challenge is, how do we represent these features in the virtual environment? Obviously we are constrained in using points and lines and polygons and pixels to essentially take all these things that are on the landscape and model them into digital features. And so one of the key sort of overarching pieces of this is obviously the interjurisdictional need for standardized data across jurisdictions. And the geography that we are working in is, at least for the initial part of this project, obviously we would like to expand this statewide eventually, but for now we're working in the metro environment. And the metro, Twin Cities metropolitan region is, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, I'm guessing most folks are on the call from Minnesota, but hopefully we've got some folks from outside Minnesota. We've got 186 individual municipal units. We've got 7 counties. We've got regional, state, and federal interests that own stormwater infrastructure. Private interests, big campuses like the U of M or 3M. And then we have watershed management units that also install various kinds of stormwater infrastructure, and other special districts like park districts and so on. So there's lots of people that have stormwater stuff on the landscape. And the challenge is, all of these entities create and maintain their own data in their own unique formats, whether it's in CAD or in GIS or a mix of the two, or paper maps, or so the data representing these features is sort of all over the place. Just to give folks a bit of a context, as I mentioned, there's 186 individual municipal units in the Twin Cities Metro. There's a large number of watershed management organizations that don't align with municipal boundaries generally. We've got 7 counties. We've got, obviously, we're within the state of Minnesota. On the east side of that black line is over in Wisconsin. And then we have other districts. This is just a sample of a few of those. So there's it's a complex landscape of folks that own and maintain these fixtures, and also the data that represent those fixtures. And you combine those together, and getting these folks to have a common sort of operating picture of their data becomes a real challenge. And the data standard that we need for this data to land in doesn't exist yet. So let's take one quick example. I've highlighted one watershed in the Twin Cities metro region here. This is the Minnehaha Creek watershed. It encompasses 24 different municipalities, parts of 2 counties, and there's obviously a number of private interests that have their campuses and sites throughout this area. This obviously encompasses the entirety of the Lake Minnetonka and surrounding lakes, and then it drains to the east of the Mississippi River. And so imagine if you're a watershed management person and want to understand the impacts there, and you're trying to collect and translate data from all of these different entities, that there is no single standard for them in which to translate that stuff, and we're trying to work with that with our project here. And so obviously we have all these tiny catchments, things that go across municipal boundaries. So it's a very complex landscape of activity, particularly in regard to the infrastructure. And we think we can do this because we've actually had some pretty good success in the past with other kinds of geospatial data. So this is a little outside of the stormwater world, but we've been able to do it with address point data for a 10-county region. We've been able to do it with road centerline data for a 10-county region. And we've been able to be successful to develop a standard and a data set representing the parks and trails, and also the parcel data for the more traditional 7-county metro region. So we've got a method of working for doing this, and we really feel we can apply that to this and hopefully begin to make some headway in getting us a stormwater data standard as well. So I'll overview the project of kind of where we're at. We've really been deeply active in it in the last 2 years. There was a state attempt at this about 12 years ago, and actually we've built upon some of the work that they put together. But that was largely driven by a couple of agencies, and this is our effort has really been to incorporate many more points of view and many more agencies at that. So we can really point to the beginning of the project in April of 2018. We were fortunate to have Hennepin County lend us their emergency operations center out in Medina in their public works, and we had a big session of 60+ people. We had a number of presentations, we had a number of small breakout groups, and got an enormous amount of feedback on what people wanted. What were the kinds of business needs they had for geospatial data representing a stormwater system? Obviously, the stormwater system means different things to different people. There are people who are specifically interested in the capacity. There's people who are interested in asset management, maintenance, and tracking. There's people who are interested in flow modeling. There's people who are interested in, risk mitigation, hazard mitigation, and also people who are very interested in environment and health, obviously with water quality and those kinds of things. And sometimes those interests overlap and sometimes they don't. And so it was good to hear from a wide group of folks on their inputs and what they needed. And so from that input, and I'm distilling this down rather heavily because there's a lot of documentation behind what we collected, but the core business needs that pretty much everybody said is like, we need to be able to do routing, flow modeling, capacity analysis. We want to be able to integrate GIS data with asset management. We want to integrate this information with the many needs of the engineering community. We want to be able to know who owns a specific asset by being able to click on it, and also the origin and the accuracy of the data that we're looking at. So those were things that were core to just about everyone who was involved. Other needs that were identified is we want to be able to use this data to be able to successfully place and understand the efficiency of best management practices. The general theme of water quality, water management obviously threaded its way through the entire discussion. There was actually emergency response and spill containment aspect of this. If you have a tanker truck full of some vile fluid that falls over and it starts dumping stuff into the system, we want to be able to model out where we can block it off and get that mediated. And then obviously using it for cartographic representation. So, and then using this as a way to improve both the quality of the data and also to improve connectivity at boundaries. So if you've got data that flows from one city into another, one county into another, being able to know where they connect was very important. Again, a distillation of those business needs, which was important for us to collect this and understand this so that we could develop a data standard to meet these needs. And I won't read through all these, but I think you can see where the over 50% shared those of all the participants shared those top 8 types of needs, what they want to work with that. So obviously determination of ownership, asset management, flow modeling, and mapping and visualization were shared amongst almost all the partners there. Again, I won't read through all of this, but again, from our kickoff date in April of 2018, we've had a number of events, our steering team, small technical breakout groups. We've presented at conferences, and that's been very helpful to get additional membership who was interested in this. Our initial call was for a dozen people to work on a steering team, and we wound up getting 20, and we've been able to maintain about anywhere from 28 to 32 people who've been consistently participating in that part of it. So it's just been very, very cool. What I like to point out is at the top of the thing is we have on April 17th of 2018, the kickoff. And then one of the last dates at the bottom is 2 years exactly to the date, April 17th, 2020, we formally released our draft out to the state. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But really the bulk of the work has been done by our steering team. We've met 6 times in full. We moved that meeting around the Metro. We had a number of small technical groups, breakout groups meeting between these meetings to bring information back. And we found that was a really good way to kind of convene the full group a couple times and move that group around the Metro. Just a fantastic group of professionals. Really, I was so gratified by both the engagement and the depth and quality of the contributions of the group. And what we did is as I said, we moved those meetings around the Metro. We met out in Chaska, we met in Bloomington, we met up in Blaine. We actually gave the host site the opportunity to do a little field trip. And so we actually visited up in Blaine. You can see up in the upper right corner. We had their water quality person take us out to an area the city had bought. It was a wetland, and kind of show some of the work that they're doing. But again, we really had a deeply engaged group. We'd meet for 3 hours. We'd throw down some coffee and donuts and really hash stuff out and work things out. It was fantastic. We had folks who were water quality specialists, water management folks, engineers, asset management folks, regulatory professionals, GIS people, public works, and folks in urban planning as well engaged in this. So it was great to get all these perspectives to really tap this standard into shape. And like I said, over a period of 18 months, we were actually able to develop a draft data standard. So I'll walk you through now the content of that data standard. Obviously, in any stormwater system, you have linear features. We broke out classification of our linear features into pipes, channels, and artificial pipes or artificial paths. Generally, pipes are things that go under the ground, channels are open to the air, and artificial paths are things that don't physically exist but are necessary for connectivity and modeling. Most of the features in our data model are represented as points. So, you know, the centroid of a basin, the site of hydro and pollution control structures, artificial points, inlets, outlets, manholes, lift stations, and so on. Those bottom three in orange, red, and blue are essentially would be points that would be part of our what we call our inspection schema. Those of you on this group are, I'm sure, intimately familiar with the MS4 program. If you are a permittee, like a city, and you discharge to a receiving water, you get an MS4 permit, and you have certain reporting requirements. You have to inspect the stormwater features within your jurisdiction at various frequencies. And so we were able to develop a schema so folks could build an application for their inspectors, and so we could have consistent data across the board. And then finally, obviously, we have the need to represent things in GIS as polygons, but maintaining separate polygons and separate points was not seen as desirable. So we basically would hold all the data in the basin points and the best management practice points, but we also have provision to be able to represent them as polygons as well. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Our draft standard kind of looks like this. It's got a real, you know, spreadsheet kind of look to it. But again, each element, whether it's pipes or channels or basins, is represented by a variety of attributes. So ID number, depth, area, contributing drainage area, very, very detailed information about each feature. And we also worked very hard to develop a list of as comprehensive as we could of domain values. So what type of material is the pipe? What shape is the pipe? You know, what are the features of the outfall? You know, what kind of filtration material are in there? We spent a lot of time tapping on the expertise of the people around the table to build, we feel, a very good data standard for stormwater. Obviously, working with the engineering and asset management community, an important part of that was being able to have anything that is in an engineering drawing or an as-built drawing needed to have a landing place in our schema. And so that was a lot of work to do that, whether it's an invert or an elevation or what datum the data is in. We worked really hard to make sure that there's a landing place in our data schema for anything that would appear on an engineering drawing. And then conversely, being able to, you know, make sure everything that's, you know, that we have, we can represent in there. And so our standard is now out for public review. As I said, we released it in April. We were going to basically just, you know, stop collection of input in July, but obviously the COVID situation has kind of put a damper on that. So we've extended it out to October. We will continue to take input on it for the entire life of its development, but we wanted to have a deadline so that we could actually have a chance to review that and modify the standard based on what we're hearing from people. So we haven't developed this in a way that we feel this is prescriptive. We want to develop it, put it out there for people to comment on and test and benefit from their experience of looking at that and modify it again, so we can continue to improve it and make sure it meets the needs of the community. So on the left is the cover of the document. On the right is essentially some sample examples of that. Every single attribute has a little block of information. It talks about the specifics of each attribute, and then we also included a number of diagrams to explain some of the concepts and things in there. So we said the difference between pipe diameter and pipe equivalent diameter. If you have a non-circular thing, you have an equivalent diameter. We want to make sure we had a way to capture those kinds of details. I mentioned the MS4 permit inspection schemas. We have an inspection schema for inlets. We have an inspection schema for outlets, and we have an inspection schema for basins and ponds. And this is designed to be a tool to help folks. If you don't have a formal inspection schema, if you want to build a mobile application, you can use this as a template for building that. We ran this past folks at the Pollution Control Agency, and they thought this was a really good idea because really there wasn't an inspection schema like this. They sort of get data in all kinds of formats, and so this is the kind of thing that would really help to have consistent data across jurisdictions and make tools that make people's work to do this a little easier. That document too is a separate document, and it's about a 40-page document that contains all the detail in there, very similar to the standard itself. And so on the left side is the cover of that document, and on the right side is the sort of sample examples of the inlet and outlet schemas. And so we talk in detail of give examples of those kinds of things. So we want to make it easy for people to engage with material. Standards are not particularly exciting. We've done our best to jazz us up with illustrations and color as best we can, but data standards are not the sexiest thing in the world, I'll admit that. One of the key features that we had, and one of the things that we really need to thank the Water Resource Center for, is they gave us a grant to develop a sample data set. So we partnered with the City of Eagan, the City of Bloomington, the Minnesota Department of Transportation, and WSB Engineering, who essentially took a chunk of the metro, and we got all of the stormwater fixtures in our study area, which, as you can see, is sort of in the south central part of the metro along the Minnesota River. So a slice of the City of Bloomington and a slice of the City of Eagan, basically two storm sheds that flow to the Minnesota River. And we got all of the stormwater data for that, and we translated that into our draft schema. And the reason we did this is we want anyone who's reviewing the standard or wants to test this out or be able to provide comment on it to actually have data in that standard. So as I mentioned earlier, every city has got their data in a different schema. Eagan and Bloomington both had their data in very different schemas. There's some MnDOT data in here. The Metropolitan Council actually has one of its wastewater treatment plants in here, so it has some data in here as well. So we have data representing at least 4 different agencies in here that we have standardized across the board, and we have made this available for folks to be able to test. If you go to I'll share with you where you could get this data if you want to take it down and test it. We created a data set that was big enough that you could see 2 storm sheds worth of activity, and there was a nice range of different kinds of features. There's lots of inlets and outlets and manholes and natural features and BMPs and those kinds of things. But we wanted to create a data set that was also small enough that you could test it out and spend time with it and bring it into your modeling software or see if it translates into your asset management software. So having a resource like this in our draft schema, we felt was a really good way for us to ensure that we could solicit input from folks to how to potentially improve this. So, and again, this is real data from 2 cities, from MnDOT and Met Council. This isn't stuff we made up. We actually got real stuff from people that they use in their day-to-day stuff, and we translated into this standard for the public to be able to take a look at and see how it works. So how do you get these materials? We have them hosted on the Metro GIS website. It's pretty easy to find. Go to metrogis.org and then go to projects and then go to stormwater data set. You'll be taken to this page, which is tells you about the project, tells you what we're doing. There's additional information. There's our project charter. There's a list of all the participants and their contact information. And if you scroll down to about the middle of the page, you'll see there's a link to the draft standard documents and pilot data set. If you click on that, you'll get a nice little tidy zip archive. It's got all of our documentation, all of those spreadsheets and those documents I shared earlier. It's got that MS4 schema in both document and spreadsheet format, and it's got the sample data set in both a geodatabase and shapefile format. If you don't have Esri software, you can still bring in the shapefile format if you're working with QGIS or some other format. So that's all there. And we encourage folks to go get that, download it, test it, provide us comments. On the website, there's a list of 3 people who you can send comments to: myself, Carrie Magnuson, who's GIS specialist with the Ramsey Washington Metro Watershed District, and Alex Blenkush, who's a GIS analyst with the Hennepin County Public Works. And so they're my co-conspirators, if you will, working on this project, keeping this together. And we're happy to accept your comments on how we can improve this. The current status of the effort, as I mentioned, we sort of did our formal launch back in April. And we blasted it out to the statewide community. We tried to reach out to the geospatial folks, stormwater folks, engineering folks, and basically say, hey, this is out there. We'd love your input. Tell us where this is weak. Tell us what we're missing. Tell us where we have things wrong so we can get it right. Tell us how we can create a standard that is worthwhile for all of us to work with. As I mentioned, all the materials are published on metrogis.org. Just go to metrogis.org, projects, and stormwater. It's very easy to find, and then we will be formally collecting stakeholder comments and input until Friday, October 30th. At that point, we'll probably convene our group again to look at what we've got, but we will continue to take comments and input on this for well into 2021. I suspect we will modify the standard one more time, and then we will put it back out there again and say, here are the changes that were recommended. What do you folks think? We want as much input from the professional community on how to make this as good as possible as we can possibly get. So, and actually so far, even though we're sort of a draft project, we've actually had some really good endorsements for it. So Peter Crosswell, who wrote the GIS Management Handbook, used our project as an example of a really good interagency scoping and documentation. And I was very flattered by that. So he basically said, this is a great charter, this is a great project, this is a great approach. And he talked about how this is a good example of how communities can work together to build resources like data standards and share data that they need. And additionally, Michael McKinney is a resource engineer who attended one of our technical sessions when we were down in Bloomington. And I kept this quote from him, and he said, from what I've seen so far, if we could begin to get data in a format like this, it would be a huge step forward for the stormwater modeling community. And this is going to be a really good tool for us. So again, getting that kind of support from the people who actually do the deep technical work is very important for us. And we want to make sure that everybody who may potentially be a user or consumer of this data or of this standard has a chance to provide their input on it. So if you're interested in this, please get in touch via email. I'll be putting my email address up here shortly. And I think Andy will be sharing out the contact information from the presenters today as well. Please check out that website. Again, metrogis.org. Just go to projects, go to stormwater. We're happy to receive your feedback and input. Please tell us where this thing can be improved. If we have missed something that's important, let us know. And if there's other folks you think would be interested in this, please forward it and pass it along. We're very much of the mind, the more the merrier, and the more brains around this, the better it's going to be. So we're happy to take your input. And again, a big thanks to our partners at the Water Resources Center and the Stormwater Research Council for their generous grant support, and to the many, many people from many agencies who've been involved with the project over the past 2 years. I'm so grateful to have so many great minds bring in so many different perspectives, and I really think our work is going to be all stronger for it. So I'm always looking for goofy pictures of stormwater features, and I really like this. Somebody spray painted a skeleton on a storm drain there. It's kind of fun. So I can be reached at either of those email addresses, both my work address at Ramsey County or my U of M address. I'm happy to respond to you as detailed as I can. So with that, I'm done. I'm happy to share these slides and field any questions that folks might have.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Geoff. I'm going to finesse a few questions here that we have. It seems to be a theme we have on MS4s and the use of this GIS data standard in terms of inspections.
Okay.
And so I'm gonna try to finesse it a little bit here. So a couple questions on, can you discuss the importance of using stormwater geodata for permit compliance and reporting, including, as many of us know, the PCA has this requirement, especially if there's a TMDL within an MS4 for reporting each year. So can you discuss a little bit about how the geodata can be used for permit compliance and reporting in the future?
Yeah, and again, I will preface this by saying I am not a regulatory expert. I am an erstwhile urban planner and GIS guy, so I am not an expert in the regulatory part. But yes, I know that recipients of MS4 permits have certain requirements for reporting pipes of certain sizes. I think there would be a desire for, if you're going to be submitting geospatial data of your fixtures, it might be good to be able to produce them in a standardized format. That's not a requirement. We have not advanced this standard as a mandate. It's very important to say we want this to be a voluntary tool that the community uses. And I don't know what the actual requirements are. I don't know how, if you can provide an analog or paper map to the PCA or in stuff in CAD or GIS. I would think that if you have the capability to be able to deliver data in GIS, that would probably be desired. And if you don't have it in any kind of standard format, or it's a bit of a hodgepodge, our standard is a good place to start, or as a way to think about it. But again, we offer it as a tool, a voluntary tool by the professional community for the professional community to use. I do not see this as being a regulatory requirement that you must use the standard.
Great. So I see there's a couple specific questions about how the draft standard would tackle mapping a couple specific items. So the one has to do with the structural and one has to do with non-structural. So let's start with structural. It's asked here, how are you taking into account like BMPs such as permeable pavements in the data or the GIS mapping?
Yeah, we've got a BMP layer that essentially you could put, you can drop a point and say, this is a permeable parking lot, and it's this many square feet. And then you could also represent it as a polygon if you wanted to. We've had some questions about green roofs, which for whatever reason we didn't think about. We realized in some of the comments that we received so far, things like tree trenches. So there's a number of things that we want to be able to expand. And so you would essentially be able to drop a point on a feature and say that, this is a parking lot made of the permeable pavement of this dimension, and it was installed in this year and this size, on and on and on with that. You could add that information there, or you could create it as a polygon and drop a point in the center of it. So we want this to be as extensible as possible. And so our BMP category is something we want to create as a, as kind of, I won't say a catch-all, it's sort of a loose term, but as a way for you to sort of say, okay, here's an infiltration basin, here's a rain garden of a certain size, here's a parking lot made out of permeable pavers. Again, this is where that GIS and asset management have this. I'm going to kind of do this little dance with my hands here. They kind of have this permeable boundary, and we want to try to integrate them together and see where that works. So a city might carry all of their parking lots in an asset management system and may not have them mapped, or vice versa. And so we want to have like I said, a landing place for that. But if we don't have basically permeable parking lots, that's something we want to add to our list of domains. So sorry, I got a little long-winded there.
Great. Well, I imagine this next question might be a little bit challenging, but I'll ask it anyways. Question about non-structural practices and including those within the data standard or GIS mapping.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, they're not point-based, but had there been conversations with your focus groups or workshops about, can GIS be used to map the non-structural elements of stormwater policy and practices?
Well, not being a stormwater expert, can you give me an example of a non-structural thing? Are we talking like a area where a certain policy is in place, or a practice, or give me an example of a non-structural piece?
Well, that was one piece I was thinking about. One might be a policy layer.
Yeah.
For example, where a policy might apply to a specific geographic region and not another. That's a non-structural practice.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a direction we could expand. I think we've had our hands full to just try to get agreement on how to represent the structures. We had a lot of very fine point discussions on what to include, where to put things in what category, and how that worked. And so again, we offer this as a draft for experts to bang on and give us feedback on. We don't pretend it to be the perfect articulation of a stormwater standard. We expect folks to give us comment and critique. And so if there is a need for a polygon layer that basically says here setback controls on lakes and those kinds of, like a zoning district or something like that, that's certainly something we can consider. But at this point, we're really not at that level. We really are focused on, and I think appropriately, the structural aspects of stuff, and getting that right, I think first will be very important.
Great. Let's go a little bit different direction with this question. So many public work units at the city level, county level, their staff and their professionals are out in the field doing inspections with iPads and iPhones and other smart devices. Do you see some of that data being able to be fed into the system that provides more input to mapping and what the end goal here is?
Ideally, yeah. And I think that speaks to, we obviously encourage folks to get out there and inspect their stuff and know the disposition of what's on of features on their landscape, infrastructure features on their landscape. It's when we get to a watershed district or a county level, and we don't expect cities to abandon their standard, say, okay, you have to use this now. We don't want to do that. But if you're a county public works agency and you know you've got city inputs coming in your system, if you can get data from the cities and have something to translate it into to link with their system, or you're a watershed district in that example I showed, to be able to do that. So if cities are using an existing data model and they want to test this out, we encourage them to check it out. We may have things they don't, they might have things we don't, which is why we're going through this draft process. So, but when you build that application for your iPad and you go out there, if you can use this schema that we have to build your application and try and it's like, oh, here's all the things for inlets, here's all the things for outlets. And actually our inlet and outlet schema, we took probably a dozen cities worth of different kinds of examples of inspection schemas, like their clipboard, their paper and pen thing that would go out, and we merged them together and sort of made a hybrid of all these things, and hopefully we got the best of all of that. So this is a tool to help folks, and we want to improve the tool with the and discover what we might be missing, what the folks need on the ground.
Great. We'll take one more question here. I think you covered parts of this in your presentation, but we'll ask it again. For BMPs that are represented as polygons, where do you draw the boundaries? For example, if you have a grassy swale, a rain garden, infiltration basin, do you include the inlets to the swale as part of the polygon, or are they point data?
The inlet itself would be a separate feature as a point, and then the polygon so the BMP would be primarily represented as a point. So let's say it's a swale. You'd have a centroid for that swale. You'd drop a point there, and then you would probably have an artificial path from the outlet to that thing. So that would be one of those artificial paths. But how you represent that polygon, we actually have a domain of values for that. Did you extract it from LiDAR? Did you heads up digitize it? Did you send someone out to GPS around it? Is it a combination of those techniques? And so we actually have a domain for, all right, we have this swale, we need the point where all the data is connected to, and then we actually have the polygon that goes around the point, which obviously polygons in the stormwater world can be very challenging because they change, season to season, rain event to rain event, but you may have a compelling need to be able to represent something as a polygon for cartographic or modeling work. And so we have a domain that basically says, how was this created? Did you digitize it from an aerial? Did you, GPS it or whatever? So we have thought about that. And I think we really want people to take a look at that and test it and see how we did.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Geoff. That's all the time we're going to have today. And so I'm sure everyone out there in the digital world is giving you a virtual round of applause today. And thank you for providing your research information with us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. And like I said, anybody who's out there, I'm happy to hear from you and answer any questions. So thank you.